It was a Tuesday morning. The entire office gathered in the main conference room for the quarterly briefing. I walked in with my folder under my arm and my back straight. 11 years of clean performance reviews. 11 years of building client accounts from nothing. Everyone in that room knew what I was expecting to hear. My name is Naomi Reed. I am the Senior Director of Client Strategy at Hartwell Group. I have spent more than a decade turning small client relationships into this company's most valuable accounts. I know this business the way a builder knows their own tools. Victor Holt stepped up to the podium. He thanked everyone for their hard work. Then he smiled and made the announcement. The new Vice President of Client Growth would be Diane Caldwell. My heart dropped. Diane was my peer. I had mentored her. 3 years ago, I personally recommended her for her first promotion at this firm. I sat completely still while the room applauded. After the meeting, I moved toward the exit and passed 2 colleagues talking in the hallway. They had not noticed me. I caught 3 words from their conversation. The complaint about. Then my own name, said in a low voice. Said like something shameful. Both of them looked up and went quiet. I walked to my office. I closed the door. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I created a new folder. I named it Files. Then I began to type. That evening, I called Yemi Ajinola. She had been my closest friend at Hartwell for 11 years. We had shared breakroom lunches, difficult clients, and the kind of honest conversations that most people save for their diaries. She answered on the second ring and sounded immediately careful. I asked her what she knew. She went quiet for a long time, then she told me everything she had heard. For weeks ago, an anonymous complaint was filed with HR. It claimed that I had been sharing confidential client documents with a company called Carousel Creative, a direct competitor, in exchange for a future senior role there. Victor Holt had received the complaint. That was why Diane had been given the VP position. I had been considered under review. People had been whispering about it for an entire month. A whole month. While I smiled in meetings. While I closed deals. While I had no idea. Do you believe it? I asked her. No, she said, I never believed it for 1 second. I asked her where the story had first come from. She paused. Then she said Diane Caldwell's name. The call went quiet. I thanked her and hung up. My daughter Zoe was doing homework in the next room. I breathed slowly, opened my laptop, and added the first timestamp to the files. I spent 3 days saying nothing and watching everything. I noted who stopped meeting my eyes in the corridor. I tracked which meeting invites I was quietly dropped from. I noticed which colleagues shifted slightly when I walked into a room. I wrote everything down. I also pulled every message Diane Caldwell had ever sent me. Emails, meeting notes, internal threads going back 2 years. I was looking for something specific. A pattern. A fingerprint. I found it in a message she sent 8 months ago during a client debrief. A specific word pairing. An unusual construction. Something that read like a verbal habit. I saved a screenshot without yet knowing exactly why it mattered. Then I found something else. Victor Holt and Diane Caldwell had worked together at their previous company, a firm called Whitmore Advisory, for 4 years before coming to Hartwell. They had both left Whitmore within 6 weeks of each other. Their professional connection dated back to 2017. This was not random gossip. This was a plan. I had been in someone's way, and they had removed me the way you remove an obstacle. Carefully. Quietly. Without obvious fingerprints. I booked an appointment with an employment attorney named Jerome Achebe. I told no one. Then I checked my inbox. A new meeting invite had arrived. Project restructure, team reassignment. Effective Friday. The reassignment moved me to something called the Internal Systems Review Team. On paper, the role sounded important. In reality, it was where careers went to quietly disappear. I showed up to my first team meeting and looked around the table. Gerald Okafor sat across from me. He had once been one of Hartwell's most respected research analysts. Now he looked like a man who had accepted a sentence he did not deserve. There was also Renata Kowalski, a former account director who had vanished from the main floor 2 years ago. And a young contractor named Theo who seemed genuinely confused about why he was there. After the meeting, Gerald fell into step beside me in the corridor and said quietly, "Welcome to the island." "How long have you been here?" I asked. "4 years," he said. I added his name to the files. Not as a suspect. As a witness. That afternoon, my first formal performance review under the new structure landed in my inbox. It covered my previous quarter. I had led 3 of the company's biggest client renewals in that quarter. All of them closed at full value. The review rated me needs improvement. It was the first below-average review I had received in 11 years. Every criticism was vague. Not one specific date or verifiable incident anywhere in the document. I saved it and immediately sent a written rebuttal requesting specifics. Then I formally requested a full copy of my HR file. In writing. Signed. With a copy to Jerome. HR replied the next morning. My file was currently under review and could not be released. Jerome Achebe sent a formal legal request for my HR file on a Wednesday. By the following Tuesday, it arrived at his office. I sat across from him and read the anonymous complaint for the first time. It was 3 pages long, specific enough to sound credible. Vague enough to be almost impossible to disprove without access to internal systems. The complaint alleged that on multiple occasions over the previous 8 months, I had shared strategic client materials with a contact at Carousel Creative. It named the contact, Simone Hargrove. It referenced specific meeting dates. The meeting dates were real. They were dates when I had legitimate, authorized client calls on my calendar. Whoever wrote the complaint had access to my schedule. Jerome looked at me. "Who has access to your calendar at Hartwell?" 3 people, my assistant B. Victor Holt. And Diane Caldwell, who still had shared calendar access from a project we co-managed 18 months ago. Access that had never been removed. Jerome wrote that down. I told him about the verbal fingerprint I had found in Diane's message. He said it was a thread, not yet evidence. But he told me to keep pulling. I went home that night and added a new section to the files. I titled it, "Who has access?" I listed 3 names. I circled one. The complaint said I had exchanged information with Simone Hargrove at Carousel Creative. I had never spoken to that woman in my life. Not at a conference. Not by email. Not once. I contacted her directly. I explained briefly that her name had appeared in a formal workplace complaint, which alleged that she and I had exchanged confidential information. I asked if she had any record of contact between us. There was a long pause. "I genuinely don't know who you are," she said. "We have never spoken. I will be contacting my own HR team about this today." Someone had used a real person's name at a real company. They had built a false relationship between us and used my actual calendar to make it look plausible. This was not gossip. This was a constructed lie. Jerome asked Hargrove to provide a written statement. She sent it within 48 hours. I added it to the files. That same evening, I looked more carefully at the performance review. Something caught my eye in the document properties. The metadata showed the review had been created 3 days before the formal review period ended. It was written before the time it was supposed to be assessing. I took a screenshot of the metadata and added it to the files. Then my phone rang. An unknown number. A man introduced himself as Callum Reeves, a journalist from an industry publication called The Agency Report. Callum Reeves told me he had received an anonymous tip 3 days earlier. It alleged that a senior director at a major agency was under formal investigation for leaking client data to a competitor. The tip did not name the agency. It named me. He said he had not published anything. He was calling to give me a chance to respond first. I thanked him. I asked if he still had the tip. He said yes. I asked if there was any metadata attached to the submission. He said he would check. I called Jerome immediately. He sent a formal request to the agency report for the submission's technical data. What his investigator found next made me grip the edge of my kitchen table. The tip had been submitted through an anonymous web form. The session came from a VPN. But the VPN had been opened from a device that briefly connected to Hartwell Group's corporate Wi-Fi 3 hours before the tip was submitted. The tip came from inside Hartwell, or from someone who had been inside Hartwell that day. Jerome said, "They are not just trying to end your career here. They are trying to make sure you cannot build one anywhere else." I added everything to the files. Then I made dinner and waited for Zoe to come home from school. She walked in, dropped her bag, and asked what was for dinner as if the world were completely normal. I was grateful for that. Gerald Okafor knocked on my office door on a Thursday afternoon. The office was a small, windowless room on the 3rd floor. Far from the main client floor where I had worked for 10 years, he closed the door. He sat down. He told me he had been watching what was happening to me and he recognized it because the same thing had happened to him. For years ago, Gerald was Hartwell's lead research analyst. An anonymous complaint alleged he had been falsifying client research data. The complaint arrived the same week he was due to be promoted to research director. He was moved to the internal systems team. The investigation was never formally closed. He was never cleared. Never charged. Just quietly removed and left there. He placed a USB drive on my desk. 2 years ago, during a fire drill, his phone was still recording because he had just ended a call. He walked past Victor Holt and Diane Caldwell in a stairwell and his phone picked up their conversation before he noticed it. He had listened once, felt sick, and put the drive away. I took it home that night and listened alone in my kitchen. The audio was imperfect. But the voices were clear enough. I heard, "Clean it up properly this time." I heard, "The complaint needs to go in before the review cycle, not after." Gerald sent me one more message before I fell asleep. There was someone before me. Her name was Solange Petit. Solange Petit responded to my LinkedIn message in 11 minutes. 3 sentences. "I know why you're reaching out. I can't discuss this online. Call me." We spoke for 2 hours on a Saturday morning while Zoe was at football practice. Her story was so close to mine that I kept finishing her sentences. 7 years at Hartwell. Senior Creative Director. An anonymous HR complaint claiming she had shared client budget details with a media contact. Performance reviews suddenly reclassified. Removed from her accounts. Moved to a coordination role that had no real purpose. She fought it for 5 months. Then her attorney told her she could keep fighting, or she could take a settlement and move on. She took it. She signed an NDA. She left in January of the same year Victor Holt was promoted to VP of Operations. "I knew I wasn't the only one," she said. "But I had nothing except my own account. And I was exhausted." I told her about Gerald. I told her about the recording. She went completely quiet. Then she said, "My NDA has an exemption. If criminal conduct is established, the agreement becomes void." My attorney flagged it at the time. I asked if she still had her documentation. She said, "I have boxes." I gave her Jerome's contact information. The files now covered 3 people, 5 years, and 72 documents. I felt something shift inside me. The shape of what I was building was becoming clear. Jerome spread the full timeline across his desk in physical form. Printed pages, color-coded, annotated. 3 employees. 5 years. The same sequence every single time, calendar access used to steal meeting dates, an anonymous complaint filed before a review cycle, a vague performance review referencing the complaint, reassignment, isolation, and then termination or a forced resignation. He looked at me and used one word. Systematic. He said this was no longer a simple employment dispute. The same method, the same actors, the same timing relative to promotion cycles. This was planned and deliberate. The false meeting dates in the complaint, pulled from my stolen calendar data, constituted fraudulent misrepresentation. The journalist tip, traceable to a Hartwell-connected device, added a separate legal dimension. Jerome had already spoken to Solange's original attorney. The NDA exemption was real and clearly drafted. If deliberate misrepresentation was established, it dissolved automatically. He told me the next step was not a complaint to HR. HR reported directly to the same executives who were involved. He recommended a formal submission to Hartwell's board of directors, bypassing management entirely, under the company's own whistleblower protection policy. I said, "I've been ready for 3 months. I just needed the files to be big enough." 2 days later, a meeting invite landed in my inbox. Probationary review meeting. Attendance mandatory. The last step before termination. I replied, confirmed. I would attend. With my attorney. I arrived at the probationary review meeting at exactly the scheduled time. Jerome walked in beside me. The moment Victor Holt saw Jerome's briefcase, he stopped mid-sentence. The HR representative, a woman named Claudette, visibly straightened in her chair. They proceeded with their script. Victor spoke about ongoing concerns. Claudette slid the probation extension document across the table. 60 days. Weekly check-ins. Vague benchmarks no one could measure. I did not touch the document. Before we continue, I said, can you provide the primary evidence underlying the original anonymous complaint? Not the complainant's identity. The actual evidence. The specific dates and documents the complaint references. Claudette said the complaint was confidential. Jerome spoke for the first time. He explained that under Hartwell's own investigation policy, any adverse employment action must be supported by documented evidence. He was formally requesting that documentation. Silence. Victor said the investigation was ongoing. Jerome asked who had authorized it. Victor named himself. Jerome asked who supervised it. Victor said HR. Claudette's pen went still. Jerome thanked them and said they would be in touch. I stood up. I had not signed a single page. I had given them nothing. Outside the building, Jerome said, they have no real documentation. The complaint was never properly investigated. It was just used as a weapon. I said quietly, I know. I've known for weeks. The board submission, all 91 pages, went out that evening. The submission arrived in the board secretary's inbox on a Tuesday evening. It was addressed to each board member individually. The cover letter was 1 page. Behind it were 90 pages of timestamped documentation, cross-referenced testimony, metadata analysis, and 3 employee accounts spanning 5 years. The final pages contained a professionally transcribed and authenticated version of Gerald's audio recording. Jerome filed simultaneous copies with Hartwell's external auditors and with the industry's governance and ethics charter body. The board moved faster than I had expected. By Thursday morning, the board chair, a man named Bernard Crane who I had never spoken to directly, had commissioned a full independent HR audit through an outside firm. The audit would cover every anonymous complaint filed across all Hartwell departments over the last 5 years. Senior management was not informed of the full scope. I was contacted for an interview on Friday. The auditor was Dr. Patricia Svensson, a forensic HR specialist with a background in corporate governance. She was precise and completely unhurried. She listened to my full account for 2 hours without once interrupting. At the end, she asked one question. Is there anything you have described that you cannot document? I thought carefully. No, I said. She closed her notebook and said, almost to herself, good. Before I left, she told me she was also requesting the complete email archives of 2 individuals. She did not say which 2. She did not need to. The audit firm's review of Diane Caldwell's email archive took 12 working days. What it found was careful, detailed, and completely damning. The anonymous HR complaint had been filed from a personal Gmail account. The account was created 11 months ago and used only 3 times. But in Diane's work cloud storage, the audit team found a version history. A draft of the complaint had been created in her work account before being copied and anonymized. The document metadata still showed her full name. This was not a concerned employee stumbling upon something wrong. This was someone sitting at a keyboard in this building, typing a lie, and then covering her tracks. Almost. The audit also confirmed the pattern across all 3 cases. In each instance, the anonymous complaint was filed within 10 days of a promotion cycle announcement. In each case, Victor Holt received the complaint before HR formally logged it. Before. Not at the same time, before. The audit's preliminary summary used careful language. Evidence consistent with a coordinated pattern of deliberate reputational interference using internal systems access. The board called an emergency session on a Thursday. That same afternoon, Jerome received a call from Bernard Crane's office. Crane wanted to meet with me directly. Friday morning, if I was available. Just the 2 of us. I confirmed immediately. I did not sleep much that night. Before I could meet with Crane, Victor Holt called me. It was Wednesday evening. I was sitting in my car outside Zoe's school, waiting for football practice to end. His number appeared on my screen. I noted it was his personal mobile, not his work line. I answered. He was controlled at first. He said the audit had created some misunderstandings. He said things had perhaps escalated further than anyone intended. Then he made an offer. If I withdrew my board submission and accepted the VP role, the one I was originally passed over for, he would arrange 12 months of back payment covering the full salary difference. He did not mention Diane Caldwell's name once. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I'll need to think about that with my attorney. I hung up. I wrote down every word of that conversation immediately. Timestamped. Detailed. I noted that he called from his personal phone, which meant he was trying to stay off any traceable work record. I noted that he offered money and a title without once mentioning the complaint, the audit, or my documentation. Which told me he already knew what the audit had found. I sent the memo to Jerome within the hour. His reply arrived in 3 minutes. This may be an attempt to obstruct the board's formal review. Do not speak to him again without me present. I added the memo to the files. 114 documents. On a Monday morning, Diane Caldwell's desk was empty. She was not late. Her computer was logged out. The small plant on her windowsill was gone. The framed photo from a company retreat was gone. HR received her resignation by email at 6 minutes past 6 in the morning. She cited personal reasons. She returned her laptop by courier. She never came in to collect anything. By 9 o'clock, the entire floor knew. By 10:30, Victor Holt had been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the board audit. The internal announcement was 1 sentence. No explanation. The kind of statement that explains everything precisely because it explains nothing. Gerald sent me a text from his personal phone. 3 words, "Island is restless." I didn't reply, but I smiled. I was in a client meeting, one I had been quietly reinstated to manage 3 days earlier, once my removal had become legally untenable, and I was presenting calmly. As if the last 4 months had never happened. At lunch, Yemi appeared at my office door for the first time since everything had started. She sat down without being invited. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You told me when I asked," I said. That was enough. Then she said, "There's a rumor Diane has already started somewhere new." I picked up my pen. Bernard Crane was not what I had expected. He did not use the careful, protective language that senior leaders usually hide behind. He met me in a small meeting room off the main boardroom and said plainly, "Before anything else, I want to acknowledge what was done to you. Not what may have been done. What was done. The audit findings are clear." He asked what I needed. I placed a document on the table. 3 conditions. He read them without speaking. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at me directly. I can agree to the first two immediately, he said. The third needs more discussion. The first condition, a full written retraction of the anonymous complaint, removed permanently from my HR file, with copies sent to every party who had received any version of the allegations, including Callum Reeves at the agency report. The second condition, immediate reinstatement of all three affected employees, myself, Gerald, and Solange, with full back pay and restored seniority, or an equivalent financial settlement for Solange given her existing NDA. The third condition, permanent, company-wide reform of Hartwell's anonymous complaint process. Named accountability. Mandatory evidence thresholds. Annual independent audits. Whistleblower protection embedded in every senior employment contract. He said, walk me through your reasoning on the third one. I did. Concisely and without hesitation. He said, give me 3 weeks. I gave him 2. The formal written retraction arrived on a Tuesday. It was 4 paragraphs long. Signed by Bernard Crane and Hartwell's head of HR. It stated, without qualification, that the anonymous complaint filed against Naomi Reed had been found to be without evidential foundation. That it was the product of deliberate misrepresentation. That it was permanently removed from my HR record with no adverse notation of any kind remaining. A copy went to Jerome. A copy went to the external auditors. A copy went to Dr. Svensson for the formal audit record, and a copy went to Callum Reeves at the agency report. He published a correction notice the following day. Brief and clear. It stated that a tip previously received, alleging misconduct by a named individual at an agency, had been formally retracted by the organization following an independent audit finding. He did not print my name. I had not asked him to. But the correction existed. It was timestamped and permanent on public record. I read the retraction 3 times at my desk. I had been waiting for this moment for 4 months. It did not feel like victory. It felt like putting down something very heavy. Like breathing out after holding your breath so long you had forgotten you were doing it. I called Gerald. I called Solange. I added the retraction to the files. 131 documents. Then my phone rang. An area code I did not recognize. The caller was a woman named Adissa Ware. She was a managing partner at Fortuna Strategy Group, a firm well regarded in the industry for building deep, lasting client relationships. She introduced herself without any preamble. She told me she had been following the situation, not the gossip, but the audit finding and the published correction. She said that people who understood how these things worked knew exactly what a formal audit-backed retraction meant. She was not calling to offer sympathy. She was calling because Fortuna had a director of client strategy position that had been open for 6 months. She had interviewed 11 candidates and found none of them right. Her exact words, I am not looking for someone who can manage accounts. I am looking for someone who built a portfolio that a competitor tried to steal through an HR complaint, because it was worth stealing. The offer was strong. Director level. My own team. My own client strategy authority. Salary significantly above what I was currently earning. An employment contract I was welcome to have reviewed before signing. I thanked her and said I needed time. I hung up and stared at the files folder on my laptop for a long moment. I did not delete it. Then I called Yemi. Not to plan anything. Not to strategize. Just to talk. It had been 4 months since we had simply talked, and I had missed her. 2 days before I planned to call Adissa Ware back with my answer, Yemi sent me a message. 3 words, you need to know. She had heard through a contact at another firm. Diane Caldwell had joined Fortuna Strategy Group. She started 2 weeks ago. She was in the client services division. I sat with that information for a long time. I called Jerome. He listened carefully. Then he said I had 3 options. I could walk away from Fortuna altogether. I could accept the offer and say nothing, managing the situation later if it came up. Or I could call Adissa Ware, tell her exactly what I knew, and let her decide what to do with it. I knew immediately which option I would choose. I had spent 4 months building a case on one core principle, that concealment was what had allowed this situation to exist and grow in the first place. I was not going to begin something new by concealing something myself. I called Odessa where that same evening. I told her that the individual formally implicated in the audit findings against me was currently employed at Fortuna Strategy Group. I told her as a plain fact, not an ultimatum. Not a demand. Just something she deserved to know before our conversation went any further. She was quiet for longer than I had expected. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me. I am going to make some calls." She called back at 9:14 the following morning. When Odessa called back, her voice was steady. But something beneath it had shifted. She told me that after our conversation the previous evening, she had pulled the audit summary from the industry's governance and ethics charter body. It was public record, available to any signatory firm. She read it in full for the first time. She had then reviewed Diane Caldwell's onboarding documentation. The reference check answers now read very differently in context. Questions about working relationships. About previous organizational departures. About reasons for leaving. She had also spoken that morning to two of her own senior team members who had known Diane from her Hartwell years. Both of them had said nothing during the hiring process because they had not been asked the right questions. She was grateful for the call. That was all she said about it. Diane Caldwell's employment at Fortuna Strategy Group ended that day. I was not given the details and I did not ask for them. What I was told was that the Director of Client Strategy role was still open. And that Odessa wanted to add one more element to the offer, a formal accountability clause, written into my contract and into every senior contract at the firm, setting clear standards for how internal complaints would be handled going forward. I smiled. "I know something about how to draft that," I said. "I was hoping you would say that," she replied. I accepted the role. My last day at Hartwell Group was a Thursday. I told only Yemi, Gerald, and my assistant B. B cried briefly in the kitchen and then apologized for it. I told her not to apologize. I meant it completely. I spent the morning finishing a document I had been quietly working on for Bernard Crane. A 24-page policy framework for reforming Hartwell's anonymous complaint system. Named accountability protocols. Mandatory evidence requirements before any complaint could be acted upon. Independent annual review. Whistleblower protections embedded at every level of the company. I had cross-referenced every section with employment law and the governance and ethics charter. It was the thing I believed was most likely to protect the next person who sat in my old chair. I emailed it to Crane at 11:51 in the morning. Attached was a separate memo addressed to the full board, marked simply, "For the record." No one had seen it yet. At noon, I cleared my desk. One box. Lighter than I expected for 11 years. Gerald walked me to the lift. He shook my hand firmly. "Will you be all right?" I asked. "I have been reinstated," he said. "With back pay." "Better than all right." The lift doors closed. I drove to Zoe's school and arrived 20 minutes early. I sat in the car with the radio off and watched the clouds moving across a sky that belonged to no one. I breathed slowly. Steadily. Completely. 2 days after I left, Bernard Crane opened the attachment marked "For the record." The memo was not a list of grievances. It was not a parting blow designed to wound anyone on the way out. It was a clear, detailed account of exactly how the campaign against me had been carried out. Step by step. From the calendar access exploitation to the complaint construction. From the journalist tip to the performance review manipulation, written plainly enough that anyone who read it would understand not just what happened, but how it worked and why it went undetected for as long as it did. I had titled it, "How a Career is Sunk, and How to Stop the Next One." Crane shared it with the full board. Then he asked Jerome for permission to share it more widely. I said yes, on one condition. It must be shared in full, without redactions, to every organization in the governance and ethics charter community that requested it. Within 7 days, 14 signatory firms had received it. Callum Reeves contacted Jerome asking if I would permit him to publish the memo as an editorial case study, with my name attached. My own words. My own account. No anonymizing. I said yes. The piece published on a Thursday. By end of day, it had been shared 38,000 times. By Friday morning, 46,000. The comments were full of 2 sentences, "This happened to me." And, "I didn't know you could fight back." 8 weeks after his reinstatement, Gerald Okafor was promoted to head of research intelligence at Hartwell Group, the role he had been denied 4 years ago, taken from him by a lie filed in a 3-page document. He sent me a message from his personal number, "I haven't cried at work since my father died. Today was close." I sent back, "You earned it both times." The same week, Solange Petit announced she had launched her own consultancy, Petit Governance Associates, specializing in HR accountability systems and workplace reputational risk management. She had 3 clients in her first month. One of them was Hartwell Group. Another she preferred not to name publicly, but I had a feeling I already knew which firm it was. I was in my 3rd week at Fortuna Strategy Group. My office had a window. The ordinary, quiet pleasure of natural light after 3 months in a windowless room was something I had not properly valued until I lost it. My team was 11 people. My first major client meeting had gone well in the particular way things go well when your preparation is welcomed rather than treated as a threat. One evening, Zoe looked up from her homework and asked me, "Are you happy?" I actually considered the question. Not the automatic answer. The real one. "I'm on my way," I said. She nodded, as though this were exactly the correct response. Then she went back to her work. 3 months after the memo was published, the Governance and Ethics Charter body released a new set of industry-wide guidelines for anonymous complaint handling. The guidelines included named accountability requirements, mandatory evidence thresholds, and independent review of any complaint used to support an adverse employment action. The press release cited several contributing sources. One was Dr. Patricia Svensson's audit report. Another was, How a Career is Sunk, and How to Stop the Next One. Jerome sent me the press release with a single line attached, "You changed a policy." I read it twice. I did not post about it publicly. I filed it. Old habit. 2 weeks later, a law student from a university I had never visited contacted Jerome asking for permission to cite the memo in a thesis on workplace reputational harm and whistleblower protections. Jerome forwarded the request. I replied, "Yes, no conditions, no charge." A former junior analyst at Hartwell sent me an email at my Fortuna address. He said he had witnessed some of what happened to me and stayed quiet, and had felt guilty ever since. He said things at Hartwell had genuinely changed. That he had recently spoken up about a similar situation and it had been handled properly and quickly. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying something when it counted. That is the only part that matters." I closed the laptop and went to collect Zoe from football practice. Same as I always had. Through all of it. 6 months later. It was a Thursday evening. I was the last one in the office at Fortuna Strategy Group, sitting at my desk with the city visible through the window behind me. My team had grown to 14 people. A new client strategy had just gone in and I was proud of it, the quiet kind of proud you feel about work done well in a room where no one needed managing around. I opened my laptop. I navigated to the files folder. I looked at it. 148 documents. 4 months of timestamps, screenshots, memos, recordings, sworn statements, and metadata trails. Everything I had built in the hours after Zoe fell asleep, in parked cars outside schools. In a windowless room on the 3rd floor where they expected me to quietly disappear. I compressed the folder. I encrypted it. I saved it somewhere only I could find it. Not because I expected to need it again. But because I am Naomi Reed and I keep my records. Then I closed the laptop, picked up my bag, and walked out into an evening that belonged entirely to me. They sank my career over gossip. I let the files grow. And in the end, the files outlasted everything they built against me. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. If you believe that patience and doing things the right way still matter, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories like this one, always told all the way to the end.